To see such bright faces after a big few days and a very exciting night. I would like to now hand over to our chair of the session. Jemima, please take over. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Seeds of Change conference. For some of us, I know it feels like day 10, yeah? The ones that had to spend 30 hours to get here. They did promise, though, that we were going to see the kangaroos. Who has sighted the kangaroos? Oh, that's a big number. About a quarter of us. I did hear there are some people who took 45 minutes yesterday trying to chase one. Please don't chase them. It's so wonderful to be here. I know I was in the conference last year, the CGIAR Collaborative Platform for Gender Research Conference last year in Addis Ababa. And I am feeling the same energy that I felt last year. So I started reflecting on why do these conferences have this vibrant energy? And I thought of 3 things. It is the first conference that people are not asking me, but why do you keep talking about gender? Because we are here because of that. You've gone to all these conferences and you are the one person that's constantly talking about gender equality, and people are asking, but you can't go on and on and on about gender. There are other things, poverty and seeds and breeding and so on. So this energy of this common conviction about the importance of gender equality that I find in these conferences it's energizing. But also because we are having very honest conversations, very reflective conversations about what is working, what is not working, and how we need to move. Where do we go from here? What else do we need to be doing, and what things do we need to be doing differently? Before I introduce this morning's keynote speakers, I wanted to mention my takeaways from yesterday, and because it will be very important to connect the conversations from yesterday with the conversations today. So 4 things that I took away yesterday. 1, from Naila Kabir's fantastic keynote last night about this need to expand the notion of agency, but also to step and look beyond what's happening with individual men and women and in the household, to look at some of the structural issues that then make the difference between whether we achieve gender equality or not. Some of those issues, structural barriers, so that we can get to true empowerment of women. And the second thing is to focus not just on the practical outcomes of well-being, but also the strategic outcomes around empowerment. And then the third thing I took away, and this is very important for us for this conference, is she said when the term empowerment went into the mainstream, a lot of its meaning changed. And in the conversations yesterday, we had a lot of great insights around real transformation, transformative change, true empowerment. How do we ensure that the meanings of those don't change when they go into the mainstream? How do we remain true to some of the things that we've been talking about? And then the 4th thing that I said again in Addis, we've been talking about women being excluded from extension systems, from the workforce. We are entering a whole new era of technological change, artificial intelligence, big data. How do we make sure that this exclusion, this bias, doesn't feed into this new technological wave that we are getting into? How do we as a community use the evidence that we have and that we know to make sure that that doesn't happen? We can't be talking about bias and exclusion in extension systems, in the workplace, And then in the next 1-2 decades, we're still talking about exclusion in this new technological wave. So just to be, we will have to be the custodians of that and to make sure that we can use all the evidence we've gathered since the 70s to make sure that this doesn't happen. Okay, so those were my 4 takeaways from yesterday. Think about them today. And now it is my absolute pleasure to invite the keynote speakers for this morning. When Rhiannon asked me to chair this session, I said, absolutely, because I get to do it with 2 fantastic women, and together I have called us the Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers because we are coming from the funding organizations. We're trying to strengthen our own organizations in terms of how we look and invest. We look at gender and invest in gender equality. But we are also working together to support the CGIAR to do the same. So, first Musketeer, and now I introduce the second Musketeer, Dr. Jayne Curnow, who's one of the conveners of this conference. Dr. Cano is the research program manager for social sciences, you can see up there, at ACIR. She chairs the gender committee there and also led the development of ACIR's gender equity strategy. She's an anthropologist with extensive experience. She's worked at the CGIAR. She's worked for universities, including the University of Adelaide. She's worked at the bank. And I always try to find interesting things about the people I introduce. So this is what I found out about Jane Cano, that she is fluent in Bahasa, in Indonesian, and in Malay. So I hope you can mix the languages as you talk to us. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, Jemima, and salamat pagi. There we go. And good morning, everybody. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also want to advise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that there will be an image in slide 4 of a person that I expect is deceased. That's just a cultural warning that has to come up front. I'm up here because I'm vertically challenged. So that's why we've had a bit of a shift this morning. So wonderful to see so many familiar faces here and make new connections. I've been feeling the love. It's been extraordinary. Yesterday, I should be absolutely exhausted, but I'm as high as a kite. I'm full of so much energy, thanks to everybody in the room here. I want to extend a particularly warm welcome to early career researchers, ACR scholarship holders, and the people in the room that got a scholarship to attend this conference specifically. Congratulations on winning your scholarships, and welcome to you. So thank you for the introduction, Jemima. I was going to go into that a little bit, not to talk about myself, but just to let you know, in this presentation, I'm going to use the royal we quite a bit. And that's because I do feel that sense of connection, even with those of you I may not have met. I know you're all from NGOs, universities or research institutions, and I feel your pain. A number of you have already talked to me about your pain points in the last couple of days, so I feel that. So I'm going to use the royal we a little bit. So today I'm going to discuss the broader landscape in which we operate. I'm going to look back a little bit, make some observations about the status quo, then I'm going to look forward and pose some questions. I'm going to begin with some further acknowledgements, and following that, I have 3 key points I want to make. I want to discuss the collaborative nature of applied social science, in which most of us are engaged, and what that entails in the field of agricultural research for development. I want to look at building a shared agenda amongst gender researchers, within the scientific community and the wider social landscape. Then I'm going to finish up by musing on how we can change the rules and pose a few further questions. Now, I received some feedback on my abstract for today's talk about the terms equity and equality. So, I've defined them here. I use the term equity to recognise that women and men come from different starting points due to historical and ongoing inequitable gender relations. Equality I see as the target, when women and men have equal rights, opportunity and status. And these are the days I dream about. Just one caveat as well. I'll move between talking about expanding research for development on gendered social relations in agriculture and working with existing gender relations with a view to moving towards equality for women in agriculture. But these can be two distinct spheres of work. Research for development on gender relations does not ipso facto need to address equality for women. Studies on masculinity are equally important. However, I see research on gendered social relations as supporting the case for equality and providing the evidence base and the business case. And if you want to look at the business case beyond our sphere, it's happening all over the place, and I'd commend to you the research on boards. Greater equity and diversity in the boardroom is delivering lots of gains. And if you have to bring it down to the financial bottom line, that's there as well. More diverse boards return greater investments for the shareholders. Better investments. Yes, I got that right. Okay. So there are so many colleagues I want to acknowledge, particularly some of my go-to people. Barbara Pamphilon, Vicky Wilde, Catherine Gibson. Are you here? Catherine, hey, good morning. Excellent. And Ruth Meinzing Dick, who said something to me one day just before I joined ACR that knocked my socks off, and it stayed with me, Ruth. We've never really worked together that closely, but you've been very important in my thinking, and all of the people that I just mentioned are as well. I also want to acknowledge the CEO of ACR, Andrew Campbell. He has created an enabling environment for us all to be here today. So, to the picture up here, I'm going to ask you, can I have a show of hands about who knows who this is? I'll give you a clue. In the black and white picture, she's 23 years old and the youngest ever member of the New Zealand Parliament. Show of hands again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, you know because you saw my presentation. 6, 7. Okay, so more and more people are getting with that. Okay, so we have a number of leading feminist economists in our midst here. This is another one, Marilyn Waring. She was incredibly important and still is, I shouldn't say the past tense, she's still incredibly important in feminist economic circles. She wrote a book that came out in 1988 and it was titled If Women Count. And we heard the ACR Commissioner, Catherine Marriott, telling us last night that in 1990 her mother was not considered a farmer, she was not counted. I believe that changed in 1994, is that right, Catherine? Yeah. So, Marilyn was at the World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980. And I'm going to quote from an article about Marilyn here, which says, when she was at this conference, Waring suddenly saw the invisibility of unpaid female labour was a much bigger human rights issue than mothering and housework. Women subsistence farmers worked from before dawn until after dusk, but only their husbands were considered farmers. So I think we should all know about Marilyn and her work, but I've singled her out here as just one example to highlight that we need to be cognizant of what many of us already know, but not everybody knows, as what's happened in the field of gender studies and equal rights for women. Too many agricultural research for development project researchers are now discovering that gendered social relations impact their research and the outcomes of their research, which is great. But then, sadly, there's still quite a few of them that sally forth as if there was not this huge body of literature and knowledge on which they can build. I know of no other area of science where you could get away with such an approach. We have to have social scientists doing social science, not well-intentioned biophysical scientists having a go at one of my favourite phrases, doing gender. How many times have you heard that? I'm going to go and do gender. We want biophysical scientists to be gender aware, but this does not qualify them to conduct the research. So coming back to women, it's been 31 years since the publication of and there's still quite a bit to be done in order to value women's work and achieve pay equality. We are still also striving to have women recognised as farmers. They are still the other. Agriculture is typically viewed as the realm of men, rendering roughly half the sector invisible. And of course that is the female half, which is extant at all nodes along the agricultural value chain. They are just invisible. So, in the Australian context, Professor Margaret Alston, who was going to join us but unfortunately is unwell, so I sent a representative instead. Margaret has an Australian Research Council project called The Invisible Farmer. Now this project is important because, and I'm going to quote from their website, women produce at least 49% of real farm income in Australia. However, if you do a Google search for Australian farmer, you will find that 80 to 90% of the images will feature men, not women. Australian Indigenous women have over 50,000 years of knowledge and experience in managing and caring for the land, yet the post-colonial or post-invasion history of Australian agriculture has tended to celebrate the role that men have played. So agricultural research for development that addresses gendered social relations is inherently multi and transdisciplinary. And I had a whole slide and I was going to bang on about the differences between those three, but I haven't got time, so if you're not sure what I mean by those differences, please go and have a look. So where we are in agriculture, doing research on gendered social relations means that except in a very few cases, we are doing multi-transdisciplinary research. We are bringing together the social and the biophysical. And I'm going to argue that it's incumbent upon social scientists doing this research to take the lead on building bridges and dispelling fear. Gender research generates a lot of fear. Fear of saying and doing the wrong thing. And fear of losing resources in a zero-sum competition for dollars. We also have to deal with disciplinary xenophobia. So we need to create the shared language and comprehension required to work across disciplinary boundaries. Recently, I was in the Philippines with a team of Australian and Filipino researchers working on an ACR commissioned project, and they commented that it was easier to work across language and cultural difference than to work across disciplinary difference. Hence, the economists from these two different countries were quicker to find common ground than the economists with the meteorologists from the same country. Social scientists know how to listen. Well, at least they should be skilled at gathering data by listening. We know how to build rapport. We can lead by example to generate a shift from inter or multidisciplinary practices to a truly transdisciplinary approach that can incubate innovation. So, how do we do this? There are many ways, but I have one simple example that has worked really well for me. And that is just learn a few words of your biophysical collaborators. If you're working with a soil scientist, do a quick search and find out what are some of the key terms that they use. The first one I ever did when I joined ACR was rhizobium. I went away and I googled rhizobium and I didn't quite, I thought, oh, okay, yeah. But then I went and asked them about it. And I put myself forward, not as the expert, but I demonstrated my willingness to listen and engage. I said, tell me about this rhizobium thing. I demonstrated how it was okay to listen and talk on a topic that really wasn't my focus area. However, sadly, not every other scientist is going to be responsive, no matter what your approach is. So I suggest taking a strengths-based approach and focus on collaborating with those that are willing to collaborate. For many social scientists, conducting research on gendered social relations in the field of agriculture is work that is done solo. You are isolated. The work may not be particularly rewarding, as gender research or activities to empower women have been tacked onto a project, not designed or thought through by a scientist with knowledge of our field, without considering how to iteratively incorporate findings into the broader research project, and so often not adequately resourced. These situations are no longer to be tolerated, and I challenge you to push back. Push back, and remember, you may be the one voice pushing back from your corner of the world, but there are many others that support your endeavours. So, the gender researcher's mode of operating has to be supported to shift from being reactive to being proactive. In reactive mode, and I'm speaking from my personal experience here, you respond to every request and knock on the door. Can you just add gender, and it needs to be submitted by 5 o'clock today. If you're lucky, 12 o'clock tomorrow. Gender researchers must be able to be proactive, to set independent and collaborative research agendas and stick to them. So this will involve pushing back and saying no and having supervisors that support this stance. So I'm highlighting this not to bring you down, because I know this is the lived experience of a lot of people in this room. There's lots of nods. But to say that we understand that there is still this reactive mode. It's still the norm. So there are significant hurdles to be leapt in order to shift to a proactive mode and elevate the status of gender research in the field of agriculture, and we are already on the way. So I remember Vicky last year saying, it's no longer a question of why we should be incorporating gender, it really is a question of how. So I want to look at how we can build up shared agendas in a few ways. Building shared agendas amongst the gender research scholars here and building out from that. So in a nutshell, what I'm really talking about is increasing our collective stocks with bridging and bonding capital. So here is an image of some gender research scholars and development practitioners and the Coalition of the Willing at ACR in May 2017. So this was a workshop with not all, but a critical mass of Australian and New Zealand researchers working on gender in agricultural research for development. This is a niche area, I think about it. This is agriculture, this is social science within agriculture, this is gender research within agriculture. Okay. So, rather a small elite, shall I say, gathering. But yeah, we are working on growing those numbers, I have to say. And in the interest of full disclosure, I roped the men in. They are not gender researchers, but they are the Coalition of the Willing. And we need more men in the Coalition of the Willing and doing gender research and in this space. I particularly want to mention Brian Cook, who is the chap on the far right there. Brian's a human geographer, is very gender aware. I would say as a social scientist, he could probably carry out a bit of research on gendered social relations, but he's actually too humble and says, oh no, I can't do that, let's get a gender scientist in to come and do that. But the reason I point out Brian is because at the workshop, we were having a discussion about the previous waves of feminism and how I was saying I believe that the dip from the previous wave had now bottomed out and that feminism and gender studies was on the ascendancy again. And this was before the Me Too movement. Brian piped up and asked how we were going to plan for the next dip. We know the advances of social movements and societal change will peak and some gains will be pulled back with a strong undertow. So how do we plan for this inevitable pushback? It's an amazing question and I still don't have the answers, and I think it's plural. We need answers for this and we know this is going to come. So how do we plan? So, as I mentioned, I think we also need to go beyond the realm of science and development to build external connections, linking to the broader societal and political landscapes in which we are operating. So we need to collaborate with those that focus on rights and services for youth, people with disabilities, or from minority races and religions. Yet, I caution, our job is always to prioritise gender equity and women's empowerment. This may sound a little contradictory, but what I'm driving at here is that we need to collaborate where there are shared agendas, but all the while mitigating against diluting the agenda to achieve gender equality, because I believe that if we have gender equality, a lot of those other sectors are going to be a whole lot better off. So, how are we, and that is the royal we, going to do things differently? I stretched this a bit so we all look far taller than we actually are. Bit of self-interest there. So, how are we going to do things differently? I've got a couple of ideas. I think first we need to genuinely acknowledge each other and those that have come before us. So you probably all know the phrase, the personal is political. Well, I say the political is also personal. Is there anyone here who has not been personally attacked or vilified for the gender-related aspects of the work that they do? Doing research in this space is often perceived as a political act with personal ramifications, far more so than any other field of research. So I think we need to acknowledge that we take the hit and we publicly recognise those that have paved the way for us, like Marilyn Waring. Let's have just as many street names, awards and statues of women as there are of men. And just on that, I have to point out that ACR has 2 scholarships named after John. We have John Allwright's and John Dillon's. But later this year, we will be announcing a scholarship named after a woman for female scientists. So that's in the pipeline. My second point, we can do things differently by working more collaboratively rather than competitively. If we go back to the nature versus nurture debates, there was an argument that working collaboratively is an inherently female trait. I do not subscribe to this point of view. I believe that working collaboratively can be done by men and women equally. I believe that working collaboratively leads to better outcomes. So this operates on several levels. Within teams, innovation is fuelled by transdisciplinary research, which of course, by its nature, is collaborative. Within organisations, stiff competition can promote excellence and spur us on. But it can also foster a zero-sum approach that privileges strong-arm us-and-them tactics with closed doors and subtractive thinking, which is ultimately very short-sighted. So I think a collaborative process opens the door and invites positive thinking. How much better is the process and outcome of the CGR call currently coming up for the new gender platform? How much better is that process going to be if those of you here from the CGIR are supported, including having adequate time and resources, to work together rather than being pitted against each other? And with the new gender platform, what will be the big focus themes or themes that the CGR will come together over and become known for? And how will they ensure that there is space for these big picture items that are going to be emblematic of the international leadership of the CGIR, but also have space for the smaller, very important research projects as well? Finally, I think we need to examine the structures that frame what we do and how we do it. And this is starting to become, I think, the theme of the conference here. Gender relations and women's equality can be a catalyst for broader change. In the last wave of feminism, one of the many debates was whether change could or should occur within existing organisational structures. Can equality flourish within our current forms of law, government, business and universities, or are these structures so overwhelmingly patriarchal, made by men, for men, that there needs to be structural change? I've quoted an anthropologist, couldn't help myself. I'm not going to read that out. I'm just going to leave that up there to feed your brains while I keep talking. So we simply have to incubate innovative approaches and new strategies to create a step change. The Me Too movement has gained ground in terms of sexual and gender-based violence. What can we do? Or are these trigger points not able to be foresighted? Nobody saw the Me Too movement coming. So if we can't foresight this, How do we prepare to capitalise on the moments when they arrive? And how do we plan to get over the next pushback that we know is going to come as this wave of interest crests and starts to subside? Universities and research institutions are now taking steps such as the SAGE and Athena Swan initiatives to measure and incentivise progress towards equality. Quotas are unpalatable to many, but have proven effective, particularly in increasing political representation. Have a look at Rwanda. However, if we lose sight of what we are building on, we are doomed to reinvent the wheel. Intelligence and good research, I'm sorry to say, is just not enough. It takes courage and political nous to change people's hearts and minds. And I know there is that courage here in this room. Interpersonal gender relations are myriad, but clearly structures and institutions have failed. In 2019, sex discrimination is alive and well. The framing of women as the second sex still finds an enabling environment in government and civil society. Equality is still a stretch target. How do we get there? I think one overarching answer is painfully simple. We have to eliminate sexism. It's not a word I hear used very much anymore. Don't know why that is. We're living in a sexist world. It privileges men. Why am I doing feminist research? Why not is everything else labelled masculinist research? Where are the points of equity to build on in order to achieve equality? We can change or adapt patriarchal structures and other paradigms that frame our world to better serve society. We can do things differently, and I want to see it happen in my lifetime, and I'm 49, so we need to get our roller skates on. So, in closing, here are the questions. I think I've raised them all already. I have changed the talk a couple of times. Here are my big questions. I'm sure Jemima's going to pose different questions for us. But in closing, I wanted to put these questions up. I want to stimulate debate, thought, and I think we can go beyond the boxes we're currently thinking in. I suspect one of the answers to probably most of these questions and a lot of the questions that we've had coming up is to start to work with a networked world rather than the isolated cells of knowledge and action in which we are currently operating. We need to link up, and we can link up. I believe the CGIAR has a role to play in this, and I expect to see the gender platform positioned to lead internationally and be the go-to repository or clearinghouse for research on gender and women's empowerment in agricultural research for development. So, I encourage you to push the boundaries to accelerate progress to the goals of gender equality, which I believe will both deliver on women's rights, reduce poverty, and benefit all of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Food for thought, huh? How are we preparing for the coming pushback? Or what structures need to change? What are the big things that we should be doing? And how are we as funders going to get behind those big things? So, questions to ponder. Thank you very much for that inspiring talk. And because I don't want us to run out of time, I'm going to introduce our next keynote speaker, my dear friend, Vicky Wilde, who's a senior program officer for agriculture development and women's economic empowerment at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Vicky is the founder and former executive director of the African Women in Agriculture Research and Development, and I know some of the award staff are here. And also the former director of the CGIAR Gender and Diversity Program. She's also had a very extensive career working for the FAO, working for IFAD, for the World Food Program and other agencies. And the one thing that I learned this morning as well about Vicky. And she has worked in a lot of war zones. And she says the way we work in development is very different from the way they work in the humanitarian. And I am hoping that she will give us that energy and urgency that you find in humanitarian organizations for us to deal with issues of gender equality and structural change. Welcome, Vicky.
Good morning. My friends and colleagues, I want to start by saying thank you to ACR and the University of Canberra and the CGIAR for bringing together so many of my friends and colleagues into one place. It is such a happy thing to be together all in one place at one time for some crucial conversations. And some of the conversations are difficult. And as Jane has just outlined for us so beautifully, thank you, Jane, this is hard work. What I'd like to share with you today is how we're thinking about this hard work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and where we've landed as a foundation in terms of what we're going to do, where we think we might have some comparative advantage, but also to share some of the behind the scenes hard lessons that we're taking for ourselves. And of course, I'm going to start, the foundation. We tend to think in big picture. So I'm going to start with some big picture, and I'm really going to try to move this microphone. There we go. At the core of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have a simple belief that all lives have equal value. And that belief has never felt more profound than it does today. And in recent years, we've come to realize that the pervasive inequities experienced by women and girls still today is holding back all of our goals. It's holding back our goals for health. It's holding back our goals for development. And so we've decided to become much more intentional about addressing root causes of poverty, inequality, particularly as experienced by women and girls. We do believe that an equal world is a better world. Looking at the big picture, we see that the world is coming along toward greater gender equality in the recent decades. But that pace of change is uneven. Vast inequalities persist. It's all too slow. Significant barriers stand in the way of women and girls' ability to thrive. We also know that very few nations have achieved meaningful reductions in poverty without first transforming their agriculture sector. We focus on inclusive agricultural transformation for two reasons. The first is because we recognize the intrinsic value of inclusion, including specific concerns for the most marginalized, neglected, and excluded. And because certain groups are overrepresented at the bottom of the income distribution. Smallholder farmers and small-scale livestock keepers, for example, are overrepresented in the lowest percentiles of national income distributions. And among these, women are poorer than men. And the second reason we focus on inclusive agriculture transformation is because we recognize it's inefficient to reduce extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity with a trickle-down approach. Growth that is not inclusive will forfeit the societal benefits of broader participation. All too often, your economic opportunities are based on who you are, by gender, class, caste, religion, sexuality, or color, rather than your actions or your aspirations. Growth does not automatically lift all boats. A majority of the world's poorest people, the 1 billion who live on less than $2 a day, are smallholder farmers who rely on agriculture to feed themselves and their families, and yet many of them cannot grow enough or raise enough to eat or to sell. This poverty is a failure of systems. It's a failure of market systems. It's a failure of financial systems. It's a failure of information network. It's a failure of policy. And when those systems do work well across society, they provide a solid ground from which individuals, families, communities can get out of poverty, even when a harvest goes bad or someone gets sick. But this poverty also is sexist. We've dug deep into the LSMS, the WEA, the DHS, and other data for Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and India, which is where we focus our investments today. We dug deep, deep, deep into this data to see what's going on. What can we learn? And we found that women are falling behind even as agriculture transforms. Across these 4 countries, there are gender gaps up to 27 percentage points between men and women in their access to inputs, assets, and market opportunities. And even as the health and education of women and girls is improving, their economic lives continue to lag. Women all too often are restricted to the lowest skilled work or the lowest value commodities. For these 4 countries, we found 20 to 53% gender gaps in income. Now, the beauty of economic empowerment interventions, and this is, frankly, we could have taken 1,000 different approaches to gender equality, but where we landed, based on our analysis of the data, is we're going to focus on women and we're going to focus on economics. That this combination is the most powerful lever still available to us today. It is still what has not been done. And the beauty of economic empowerment interventions, like increasing women's land rights, their access to agriculture markets, and financial inclusion, is they have huge spillover effects. Directly, these interventions do reduce poverty. And indirectly, they encourage women to expand their sense of self and to challenge the unwritten rules that say women are lesser than men. But it can be particularly challenging to upgrade the economic lives of women in agriculture. By and large, the agriculture sector is the sector of last resort. Most farming, it's necessity-based. It's what women really want. And what they want for their children is to get out of the back-breaking work of agriculture, to get out of farming. In Nigeria, for example, women are getting out of farming faster than men. But the problem is this: they're trading subsistence farming for subsistence enterprise. And their incomes are not improving at all. Most poor women in the geographies where we focus will continue to depend on agriculture for the short and medium term, largely due to the lack of any good options. In most of the geographies where we focus, decent wage job options are not there, and they're not yet emerging. And for the growing numbers of women in agriculture who do opt for enterprise, for entrepreneurship, the challenges are many. Africa is the only region in the world where more women than men choose to be entrepreneurs. But their enterprises post monthly profits that are on average 38% lower than men's. A study of market vendors in India, too, shows that women-owned businesses underperform compared to men's. In both continents, women's enterprises tend to have fewer employees, lower average sales, less value add. So here we are. Despite women's pervasive roles in agriculture on farm and off farm, the returns on their labor are really low, unrewarding, largely due to social norms that restrict their mobility, their control of assets, and pose really high entry barriers to more lucrative opportunities. So what you have are the system failures combined with the social norms restricting improvements. It's a terrible sandwich. But what we have to do is think at both levels. In this room, we have the creators and users for dozens of the tools, the methods, the models, the programs designed to overcome these social norm barriers. But I propose that the biggest challenge of all is that rather than working with a few hundred women here or a few thousand households there, is to create system change. If the poverty of smallholder farmers is the failure of systems, and if that poverty is sexist, we are challenged to create change at scale. Now, we're all still learning what works and what doesn't. So I'd like to share a few of our hard lessons. At the Gates Foundation, as we're working on our strategy for women's economic empowerment, we looked back at about $800 million of investments that we had made in women and in markets. And we reached a new realization. And this will be controversial. Unless there is a pull of market demand or the integration in a pervasive government program like social protection programs or extension, no amount of gender analysis or clever gender transformation design will be scalable or sustainable, and it won't get women out of poverty. Our landscaping in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and India revealed 120 different business models and institutional partnerships trying to connect farmers and markets. We looked at outgrower schemes, we looked at farmer field schools, we looked at agro dealerships, we looked at poverty graduation programs, we looked at 120 models. This is what we do. And we found that women's inclusion is rarely the norm, and that most of these models prove to be inadequately profitable for the farmers, and that very few achieve scale. So we did another study. We looked at $6.4 billion in market investments in sub-Saharan Africa. What are they doing? What are they learning? What impact are they having? And we found that most of them are addressing supply side only. They're still focused on increasing yield without taking into account what the market wants. Who's going to buy that yield? Less than 9% of those investments include any focus on women's assets and their time or mobility constraints. And we also found that more than 95% of this funding is in the hands of just 4 donors, not including us. And that very few of these programs could report their results by sex. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? Taking these hard lessons, what have we decided to do? At the Gates Foundation, we always start by trying to get crisp about what we're solving for. In our agriculture team, we've decided it's this. We're solving to increase women's incomes and their decision-making over the benefits of that income. And I'd like to let my boss, Bill, share one little example with you. But first, you have to look at this cute picture. This is from an investment I've made in Bihar, India. And it is about the very poorest women. They are landless. They are low caste, many of them Muslim. Their only precious asset is a goat. Now, women in goatery projects are not that atypical. You might say that's a classic old gender type of investment, right? But here's what we did differently. We designed for scale and sustainability from day one. We wanted to address the fact that these women's only precious asset has a mortality rate of 40 to 50% because there's zero animal health services, because women's goats are not a priority to the government and to the departments of animal husbandry. They're more focused on dairy and the more profitable animals. So we're training up a healthcare delivery system for the goats, but we're doing it in such a way from day one, it is, women are entrepreneurs. They charge for each of their services. From day one, it's a business. But we did this too by leveraging a government platform of self-help groups. Self-help groups are proven to expand women's empowerment in a number of ways. And they're proven to have good outcomes for maternal health and for newborn health too. But they've not been proven at all to reduce poverty. So you can expand women's agency and still they're poor. And they don't want to stay poor. So what can we layer in? In Bihar, India, you've got this government platform of self-help groups with all these initial benefits that's already reaching 18 million women. 18 million women. So we're layering this intervention into that platform. We're also leveraging a World Bank investment of $450 million for increasing livelihoods. We've also solved for the vaccine value chain down the road. I won't go into all of it, but let me let my boss show you what it looks like.
Can goats empower women? In the poorest areas of India, they already are. This is thanks to a heroic team of health workers called Pashu Sakhis.
1/6 of the world's population of goats is in India. They are such a strong source of livelihood for very poor people.
बकरी तो एटीएम की तरह है, जैसे कि अगर कोई ज़रूरत हुआ तो हम अभी बेच सकते हैं.
So it's not easy being a woman anywhere in the world.
वो हमेशा सोचते रहते कि नहीं तुम घर से बाहर तुमको नहीं जाना है, कुछ भी नहीं करना है.
Goat rearing is primarily done by women. They manage the goat flocks, they take them out for grazing. They are the ones who first spot the signs that a goat is unwell. What we're trying to do is empower women to have a much greater control over the income that they get from goat rearing. When women own the income that they earn, that income is used for the betterment of their households. So whether it's for nutrition, whether it's for their children's education. Pashu Sakhi literally translates into friend of the animal.
तब तो उसको मतलब प्यार दुलार करते हैं.
Pashu Sakhis provide vaccination services, deworming services so that goats can be healthier. And she needs to be very strong in her character. A major challenge that we had understood from the communities was that there was high mortality of goat flocks.
बहुत बकरियां मर जाती थी। जब से टीकाकरण करने लगे हैं और दवा पिलाने लगे हैं तो बकरी ठीक रहता है।
From the initial days of about 40% mortality, we have been able to bring down mortality rates to under 10%. When people see that the goats are healthier, when they see that they're able to get more money from their goats, they do respect the Pashu Sakhi for the work that she is doing.
पहले कुछ भी नहीं करते थे, कपड़ा तक भी नहीं धोते थे, खाना खा लिया वहाँ थाली भी छोड़ देते थे, अब बर्तन भी साफ कर लेते हैं।
I really would consider Pashu Sakhis as heroes, making a difference in the communities, making a difference in the lives of the poorest.
दीदी को समझा पाएंगे अब, अगर दीदी भी समझेगी, अच्छा से बकरी पालन भी करेगी, आमदनी बढ़ेगा, गांव भी बदल सकता है, समाज भी बदलेगा।
Thank you. So this is just one example of an investment where we're solving for that sandwich, the gender transformation work on the ground and with the women, and the system change throughout the state. Our investment's directly benefiting 50,000 women, but already the government is scaling it out, and it's going to reach 1 million women in the short term, and beyond that, we'll see, and now other states want to replicate and so on. So it's driving for that scale from day one. So going forward at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in agriculture, most of our forthcoming investments are going to focus, at least for me, on women's economic empowerment, and they're going to focus on women's market inclusion, with an emphasis on building or leveraging women's collective action through producer collectives and digital platforms, increasing the profitability of women's entrepreneurship, and engaging agribusiness to solve for more inclusive and equitable returns in their value chains. Now, this is going to take a lot of innovation, and frankly, we count on you. We count on your research and your experience to show us what works, how to remove the barriers that all too often stand in the way of progress for women and girls. And for me, a great advantage of this conference is that I get to say thank you to you. Thank you for the hard work you're doing to build the evidence on the evidence of women's collective action, the power of women's financial inclusion, the game-changing power of women's land tenure security. Thank you for testing the metrics, for measuring women and men's relative empowerment in crop, livestock, and nutrition investments. Thank you for teaching us about the ladder for building women's livestock assets, and for mapping out the promise of aquaculture for nutrition and income gains. Thank you for developing the protocol for incorporating gender into crop breeding and seed systems. And thank you for reminding us about the importance of engaging men and boys as allies. And so much more. There's a couple things we really need going forward. First is the rigorous documentation of what works and does not work by gender to ensure equitable access to the technologies, the services, the knowledge generated by agriculture development programs. In other words, how do we build the on-ramps for more equitable participation in new opportunities that will emerge as agriculture sector transforms? And we have to learn how to use that evidence to influence the system change, to influence the policymakers and the agencies of development. Second, we need more rigorous documentation of what works and does not work by gender to help smallholder farmers, small-scale livestock keepers increase their assets, increase the returns to the use of those assets. And we know it's no easy task to address this because today it's highly gendered, there are pervasive imbalances, but we can start by being more intentional. We need to document the distributional consequences of agriculture interventions, and we need to document also the unintended consequences. Together, like Jane said, as the researchers, as the implementation agencies and the donors, we need to build the scaffolding for change. We need to build the scaffolding that provides the space for more agency, especially among the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, and to empower women and girls. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Powerful message. I especially like your analogy of the sandwich, that we need to look at both the norms and the individual men and women, but also at the structural issues. I want to hand over the microphone to Barbara, but before I do that, Cheryl reminded me that I have to say one thing, that we do actually have a journal. It's called the International Journal for Gender, Agriculture, and Food Security. And if you have interesting papers of the kind of documentation that Vicky is talking about, what works, how do we get to inclusive agricultural transformation, please send them to us, because we would like to disseminate that information as we seek to go to scale with some of the work that we are doing. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Jemima. I know that everybody has really had the perfect impact from a keynote. We all want to ask so many questions, do so much more thinking, and we will be having a process to do that. But isn't that the sign of a great keynote, where you want more and you've got a whole lot of questions you want to ask or think through? So I'd like to thank Jane very much on behalf of everybody here. Oh. And Vicky, thank you so much. And of course, a small thank you to our wonderful chair. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Ewan, who will lead us through the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Jane. And thank you also, Jemima, for very inspiring words about this keynote. A couple of things to mention before we actually look and sort of, process these rich ideas we've heard. Some things that really stuck around with me. Oh, and maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to actually introduce myself, I guess. My name is Ewen Leborgne. I work together with Rhiannon Pyburn and Andrea Vos with the CGIAR Collaborative Platform for Gender Research, hosted by KIT, Rural Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Yeah, we are very pleased to co-host this conference. And so a couple of things that just came up to me listening to your keynotes were that you really encouraged us to fight disciplinary xenophobia, that is in our workplace and across the work that we're doing. I also really liked the fact that you really particularly want us to prepare ourselves for this pushback proactively, to really think ahead, and to increase one yield, the yield of really great gender equality strategies that will get us where we need to be. Because we are, as researchers, idea farmers, question farmers, and there's a lot we can do towards that end. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Try to increase that yield of ideas from what you've heard from these two keynotes from Jane Curnow and Vicky Wilde. And this is how we're going to proceed. We have a clicker. Seeds of ideas. Again, we're idea farmers, question farmers, but particularly, I would like you to turn to two other people and preferably some people that you haven't really talked to, if you can. If you're just surrounded by friends, that's also great. But if there's two people next to you that you haven't met yet, here's an occasion to do that. And think particularly about the first question. Is there any idea from the keynote that you would like to, that you think could really create inclusive transformation? Either in the place where you work, could be your own organization, or in where you live, could be in your community. It could also be in the project work that you do. Yeah? If you have some time, you can also try address the second question. And if you're really running out of time because you've explored everything, then feel free to make more friends next to you. Okay? So let's take about 10, 12 minutes to do that, and then we'll just tease out a few ideas together with Anne Hill, who's helping me with this session. Take it away.
What was going on?
This one works.
I can change it temporarily, but I'll need it back at the end because we've got to make announcements for morning tea.
One minute. Last idea, last idea.
Tired. And I'm from here. I don't get I'm coping, really.
You're socializing with others, empathizing, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, could we please stop? Please stop. Thank you. Wow, what a buzz. Clearly, we're sowing a lot of seeds for change here. So we'd love to hear any ideas that you've been exchanging. And we're not so much interested in the questions you have for the speakers. We will give you the privilege of addressing directly the speakers at coffee break to have some answers to your questions. But we'd really like to hear some examples from your workplace or your projects or your community, your life, around how do we make this inclusive transformation work in practice. Anyone would like to share any anecdote or insight?
Hi, yeah, so we were having an interesting conversation about income and markets.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, yes, my name is Christy Dritzer. I'm a consultant, former colleague working and living in Ethiopia. We were talking about income and markets and whether when programs focus on that, the things that women value fall apart. So Marilyn Waring's work on what counts and that women's work doesn't count. And in many programs, even those that start off well, when there's an income focus, the strength of the community can dwindle, and that individualism that's at odds with many of the cultures we work in can lead to exploitation and a whole range of other factors. And we talked about some of the transformative methods, such as the ABCD, which is the asset-based community development, and how it goes into communities and gets them to look at what resources they have available, what they might need to reduce labour, and the market is one part of it, but it's not the only part or the only focus. And from that, the community gets stronger as well as individual households doing better.
I'm sure that a certain professor, Catherine Gibson, would be very happy to hear this. Thank you very much, Christy. Anyone else? Over there.
I'm Ruth Meinzendick from IFPRI, and we didn't actually answer that question, but we picked up on this issue of rigorous evidence and said it's not just about what works, but we need to look at how it works and be honest about what doesn't work. And then perhaps also, and that also is going to require longer time horizons, the iterative learning that Naila mentioned last night, and that also don't shy away from complexity in this, but also then we need to study the effect of gender-blind projects, and where those don't work, quit funding them. So market integration programs, we know that many of them have in effect taken control of produce away from women and put it under men. Those things need to be challenged in the mainstream. And finally, Jane, to your question of how do we prepare for the next downswing, long-term funding horizons would be lovely.
So, a very strong plea to not go for the quick fixes and the short solutions. Think long term, think long game. Hello. Quick reaction to this before we take this one, is that okay?
Just a little plug for ACR on that. One of the reasons I joined ACR is because they have, a 4 to 6 year time horizon for individual projects usually, but we also realise that can be inadequate as well. So we now have an opportunity to look at 10-year horizons. So we can't give you 10 years of funding up front, but what we can say is you can plan now for 4 and 2 or whatever works for the research. It's driven by the research, and we are looking at 10-year time horizons for some flagship research projects.
Great. Thank you, Jane.
Hi, I am Ejaz from Pakistan, and I'm working in the dairy beef project. We are also working with the collaborative approach that we are focusing collaborative approach for transformational changes, like we are working with a different organization. We involve the different organization for the inclusion of gender that we can help all discipline in this act.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other reaction? Maybe on this side? I see a hand up over there, right behind you.
Thanks very much. I'm Deepa Joshi from IMI and the WLE program of the CGIAR. I want to respond to Vicky's point about systemic changes and unfolding these within the institutional settings in which we work. There were 3 really interesting presentations yesterday by 3 young researchers who talked about the fact that all of this good intention and the sort of meaningful attention to gender and inclusion now, especially now, often meets with enormous resistance at the institutional levels, and especially in the agriculture sector, which, if you will all be well aware, has been predominantly led and designed by male researchers. So how do we bring about this change? And I think a fundamental issue is about rethinking organizations and reinstitutionalizing the culture of inclusion in these institutions. So I think donors also would really gain from paying attention to these issues and sort of investing in institutional change in the systems and structures in which we work. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deepa. Oh, right next to you.
I'm Nina Joshi from Heifer International, working in Nepal. When Vicky was speaking about women, small women in market, that resonated to all that we do. And I totally agree that we, as an institution that focused on livestock, worked very long on productivity, production, and then gradually started to realize that market is what we decide. So recently we've been working a project and have very interesting outcomes around how women can brought into the market, especially, and we had a very interesting conversation in our group, and it's women and market, they are very scary combinations. So, but the experience that we have in the work we do is when it's a collective effort, when we bring women together, it's, especially smallholders, it's a production by mass, and that has the bargaining power. So we had some very interesting outcomes around that. I'd be very happy to speak to you during break.
Some interesting interactions over the break. And we have here.
Yes, I'm Lone Badstue. I work with CIMMYT. But my comment actually is not on behalf of CIMMYT. It's on behalf of a lot of us in the CGIAR gender research community. And if we think about what has happened over the latest, let's say, 5 years or so, or more even, we're going back to 2013, those of us who are rooted in more qualitative approaches have managed to come together from a bottom-up initiative. And we've struggled, but we managed to get little bits of money from here and there until we actually got a genuine larger funding that could keep us together for a while, so that we could finally, together, be stronger around a different perspective on science, on knowledge, on ways of knowing, and also address that one part of the sandwich that Jemima and Vicky were talking about, that one about the unwritten parts, the parts that are underneath the lower part of the iceberg, the social norms and aspects. And I think that is a change in our own way, in our own institution, in our own, and it's beginning to trickle into our institutes. It doesn't go fast, but we need that longer term funding, yes.
I sense there is a pattern here about the funded partnership to really get this going in a stronger and more integrated way. Thank you very much. We're actually going to call this session to a halt. I just want to make also a very quick plug, since we're interested in documenting this change, documenting what works, documenting what doesn't work. We'd be very happy at the CGIAR Collaborative Platform for Gender Research to receive your papers, research methods, data challenges, anything that documents these experiences. So feel free to come back to any of us so that we can help make your work more visible for everyone's benefit. On this note, thank you all very much again for your engagement. Thank you.
And I would like to very much thank Ewan and Anne for preparing and designing these sessions straight after the keynote, because we wanted to have an opportunity to go beyond the one or two questions and really get people thinking after a keynote. And I think Anne and Ewan have done a stunning job. I have a gift for them. It's virtual, because it's in the office. So please, may I give them a virtual gift and promise that I will bring the real one after I go back. Thank you, Ewan. And thank you, Anne, very much. Just a couple of announcements, please. Firstly, just a lost and found from last night. This was